you, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks so much for having me. As Tom mentioned, my presentation today deals with humanitarian security, in particular in relation to conflict-affected operational environments. It's based on my PhD thesis and research that I did between 2019 and 2023, and just recently defended at the University of Helsinki. And I thought that rather than even attempting to kind of recap the work that I've done over the past 4.5 years, I'll pick and choose some key themes and findings that I thought might be of interest to you guys. And then I hope that these will act as kind of a conversation starter for the next part of the seminar. Before I get into the research itself, I'd like to talk a little bit about how I, as a researcher, perceive the humanitarian system and its functions and its key actors, just to get the conversation going and to put us all on the same page. So I'll start with the idea of the humanitarian ecosystem. When we think of humanitarian action, we tend to think of aid workers, maybe the organizations they work for, the UN, donors, humanitarian beneficiaries for sure, and so on and so forth. So a bunch of different human individuals or institutions or organizations run by humans, and the relations between these different entities or actors are often visualized, or humanitarian international organizations, maybe ICRC, MSF, etc. Smaller national, international organizations, aid workers, beneficiaries, grassroots organizations. And while these are very good ways of highlighting kind of the power imbalances and where the decision-making power and resources rest in the humanitarian system, I think they still leave a lot of things unsaid, or perhaps even invisible, in terms of the plurality of different actors, entities, forces that are involved in aid provision. So in my own work, I use a bit more of a kind of network approach to what humanitarian action to me is. As we can see here, there's many of the key actors that I just mentioned to you guys, but there are also a number of norms and different materialities, different resources, ideologies, other issues at play that are much more difficult to grasp. And all of these are interlinked, they influence one another of interactions. And from this web, to me, is where the security kind of emerges. And as you can imagine already, it is the bottom right-hand corner is where my research focuses. The different obstacles that aid workers encounter in their daily work, as well as the counter forces or the actors that bring about these obstacles and that are then used to attain their own aims and objectives. The meaning of this chart will become clearer as my presentation goes on, so I'd like you to kind of hold on to this image at the backs of your minds, and I will then revert back to it and we can talk further also after the presentation. So about my work itself next. The thesis is called Invisible Threats from earlier this year, and it focuses on the making and unmaking of humanitarian security in conflict-affected environments. It's an article-based doctoral dissertation that focuses on a case study of the Syrian civil war and the first decade of it. I used 3 types of qualitative data consisting of expert interviews with aid providers, both national and international, policymakers, other experts knowledgeable of the security situation in Syria, as well as UN Security Council meeting transcripts, focusing in particular on the Syrian crisis, of course, and then field reports released by aid organizations during the recent COVID-19 outbreak. Data was analyzed using diffractive and close reading, and it was then used to produce 4 peer-reviewed academic articles, 3 of which have thus far been published. I think Tom said that he might share the links in the chat. In addition to that, they'll be at the end of my presentation, so you'll be able to access. If you have any trouble getting to these publications, if you don't have subscription to the journal or something, feel free to reach out, and I'd be very happy to provide you a PDF copy. But as said, the objective of my work was to understand the problem or the challenge that insecurity poses to aid providers in conflict-affected areas. And I propose to do this by focusing on the different kinds of entanglements between humanitarian actors and their extended operational environment. Now, what do I mean by this? When I say extended operational environment, I refer to a bit back to the chart that I showed you in the beginning, this idea that aid provision is not just aid workers in a specific set physical immediate environment from where threats come to their safety and security, but is shaped and conditioned by various kinds of institutional, political, ideological, legal, various kinds of normative frameworks that enable aid provision to take place or sometimes inhibit it. The concept of entanglements then refers to the kind of co-constitutive or interlinked relationship between these 2 dimensions of aid provision. This is one way of conceptualizing it. So we have aid worker security kind of sandwiched between the rules-based international humanitarian system that sets out the processes, that sets out the norms of what aid work should be, how it should function, and then the actual reality of aid provision that aid workers encounter in the field. And as you can see, the relationship between 2 is not static, it's not set, but the 2 constantly kind of challenge and shape one another. I prepared 2 short case studies to exemplify a bit better what I mean by this. The first one deals with identifying and addressing risks, in particular in relation to the security of national humanitarian personnel versus international or expatriate personnel. As many of you may know, vast majority of humanitarian victims or aid workers who are affected by violence and insecurity in their daily work are national humanitarian personnel. Over 90% in general, the figure remains largely similar, independent of the kind of temporal or historical period, the years that we're looking at, as well as the different kinds of categories, whether we're talking about individuals who have been killed in action or at work, who've been wounded or who've been kidnapped. In all of these categories, national personnel represent the vast majority. There are many different causes for this imbalance if we look at existing research. On the one hand, national personnel quite simply make up the vast majority of humanitarian personnel. They make up more than 90% of the aid workers currently active in conflict and crisis affected areas around the world. On the other, there are also a number of different institutional and structural issues that make them particularly vulnerable to violence and kind of accentuate their insecurity. There's, for example, research that indicates that national personnel have significantly less access to security trainings. They have less opportunities for international mobility. By this, I mean that when security situation deteriorates, for example, international personnel often get relocated to safer areas. They tend to get evacuated or even repatriated to their home countries, whereas national personnel tend to stay and continue with the daily operations. And there's also research to indicate that national personnel are given more dangerous tasks than international employees. So what does my own research say about this entanglement between internal and external causes for humanitarian insecurity? When I spoke with aid workers, when I did my interviews, a lot of the Syrian personnel in particular mentioned that they had been exposed either to violence or the threat of violence already before they became involved with kind of official humanitarian work, or they became involved with international aid organizations or the international humanitarian system. Many were telling me that they were providing assistance to individuals who'd been injured in demonstrations and hence faced a threat or a threat of persecution from the Syrian government or the Assad regime. What is more, we can see here that their insecurity kind of tends to begin, at least in Syria, a little bit before the humanitarian system kind of sets in and all the structures get to put into place and all the monitoring mechanisms start to function, but also their security continues after. Many project managers, in this case international personnel, mentioned that they don't actually know what happens to national personnel who are caught working in opposition-held areas after the Syrian forces or Syrian government forces regain control of these areas. As a background information, in the beginning of the conflict in 2012, the Syrian government adopted laws that effectively criminalize the provision of medical assistance to populations in opposition-held areas and perceived opposition supporters. So what happens then when you're caught in this action after Syrian government forces regain possession of these areas? Also, what happens to many individuals whom I spoke to who were already being forced to escape from Syria, were coordinating aid into the country but living abroad, in this case in Gaziantep in Turkey? They will have to make the choice of whether to seek refuge outside of their home country or whether to return and take their chances with a regime that is potentially hostile towards them and take the risk of potentially being facing legal action, incarceration, and so on and so forth. So from this, to put it into a bit of a more analytical setting, I say that national personnel suffer from this kind of slow violence that occurs gradually and takes place over an extended period of time. It begins earlier and it continues further. And this is very different from the kind of explosive violence that we often read about in the international news, in the media, that much of the research also focuses on, these kinds of individual cases of shootings or kidnappings that occur. They're easy to quantify and enumerate, they're easy to render into statistics, and thus also render visible and raise awareness of. So this kind of slow violence, slow insecurity that national personnel are exposed happens a bit under the radar of the current structures of the humanitarian security system. And hence, there is a risk that it becomes invisible, that is not so easily detected, and that it can even further contribute to the marginalization of national humanitarian personnel and their security needs, in addition to those considerations that I mentioned in the beginning of this slide. Another case that I wanted to present, let me just see how I'm doing time, fine. Another case that I wanted to highlight deals with the role of international law in general, in protecting humanitarian personnel in conflict-affected areas. As you of course know, humanitarian action is governed by various different laws, rules, and regulations. In conflict-affected areas, perhaps the most important one is international humanitarian law, which sets out the rights and responsibilities of different actors in these areas. From the perspective of the warring parties, it obliges them to follow the principles of distinction and proportionality. And from the perspective of humanitarian actors or emergency relief providers, it grants them safe and secure passage to the vulnerable communities. So we can say that international humanitarian law, IHL for short, protects emergency relief providers during times of war. This said, there's also research to indicate that in some cases, law can also be a source of insecurity. Some examples that I raised here highlighted the fact that targeting emergency relief providers is criminalized, is not allowed under international law, can give, in some cases, a false sense of security and lead to misguided or insufficient security policies. Law can also incentivize violence by reinforcing a kind of perceptual link between aid work and those who provide it, and certain Western norms and values. And finally, law can also provide an opportunity for legitimating or justifying violent incidents. I'm sure many of us have noticed that over the past years in various different contexts, there have been a number of cases of, for example, hospital strikes being justified by claiming that the facilities have been used not for humanitarian purposes, or not only for humanitarian purposes or provision of medical assistance, but also for military purposes, such as shielding troops, equipment, or for other things. And then this gives a cause to suggest that they were in fact legitimate military targets rather than protected humanitarian facilities. So again, what does my own research add to that? When I was looking at the transcripts from the UN Security Council on Syria, they did indeed show that law can be used to both contest and renegotiate the limits of allowed military action. Some of the speakers, in particular the representatives or the state representatives of Syria and Russia, have used certain legal caveats to legitimate violence, including the use of the shielding argument that I just mentioned in relation to the hospital bombings. And these processes have politicized, or these efforts to politicize the law and humanitarian aid have kind of seeped into the processes of the UN and rendered it very difficult or virtually impossible to produce evidence on violent incidents or attacks that would then be acknowledged and accepted by all parties, and thus made it difficult to hold the perpetrators of violence accountable for their actions. Furthermore, there have also been efforts to legitimate violence against humanitarian actors by suggesting that certain actors, in particular national aid workers, have been politically active members of the society and in the conflict, and thus are failing to adhere to the principles of impartiality and neutrality, and thus are not, in fact, humanitarian actors at all, or at least that is not their primary identity. So what does all of this tell us? To me, it tells that security is not only about explosive violence, immediate threats, about the immediate environment in which aid work is carried out. It's also about the different institutional structures, also in this case, legal structures that used to govern aid work, the underlying assumptions we have about security, different norms, principles, and everyday modes of action that take place in the field. And these all kind of come together in making security. So from the two case studies, for example, when you think back to the chart that I showed you in the beginning, if you recall, it had various different components, and then the obstacles and the counterforces were isolated into one corner, and the kind of threat and violence was emanating from that corner. And this kind of representation gives us a very static idea of what security is. And I don't really think that. I think in reality, the situation is not quite so stable. What the two case studies show that I mentioned just now is that the threat that comes from the counterforces, these different obstacles, they influence and they pass through the different components of the humanitarian system, and they alter these components in the process. So, for example, the protective structures of the humanitarian security system can, in fact, protect, or they may increase insecurity for certain parts of the humanitarian professional population or workforce by rendering certain kinds of violence more difficult to recognize, perhaps invisible, by determining how risks are allocated among aid providers, and so on and so forth. Also, law, similarly, it can either protect aid providers or it can perpetuate insecurity, depending on the context and depending on the ways in which it is used and perhaps manipulated. So these relations that I showed in the chart, they're not fixed and they're not static, they're shifting and changing, and it's in a flux. And this also, to me, means that security is not a fixed good, is not kind of a threshold to which we can aspire to and then achieve, and they kind of stay above that threshold, but is constantly kind of co-created between the different actors involved in aid provision. So what to do about this? To address humanitarian security, or the question of insecurity, then, I believe we need to reconsider a little bit the different definitions and assumptions that we have about humanitarian aid and about security itself. How are some of the key terms, security, violence, risk, threat, and so on and so forth, how are they defined? How are risks calculated? And importantly, whose experiences do these definitions represent? Whose voices is heard and whose is not? How are different kinds of established modes of action of thought also challenged? And what are the consequences of this challenging? And I believe that this is a task for researchers, for sure, but I think also for humanitarian practitioners who come into contact with security issues in their daily work, to kind of reconsider these assumptions that they have at the back of their minds, and perhaps then be open to altering them as depending on the context in which they work. I also believe that this is an issue of growing importance due to the way in which many of the humanitarian kind of mega trends seem to be converging at the moment, starting from kind of increasing humanitarian needs through the ongoing process of localizing aid provision, as well as the ongoing rise in the number of active violent conflicts. I'm just about reaching the end of my time, so I will stop here. I very much look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. As promised, here's a list of publications. If you need any further information, please get in touch. Also, if you need any further reading or if you're interested in some of the other sources I mentioned in my presentation, please shoot me a message and I'd be happy to help you out. All right, I give the floor back to Tom and Rod. Thanks.
Nazanin, I see that you have your hand raised, and my apologies, but I just wanted to give the floor to Rod, so that he can come in with some of his reflections on Ida's presentation.
Thanks so much, Tom. And thanks so much, Ida. It was fascinating, your presentation, and also, yeah, your work that I have been reading. So thanks for that. Actually, because of the sake of time, I will shorten my comments. I will go more to the questions. My focus of research is also safety security, but not necessarily of 8 actors, but of us, or many of us, researchers, academics. How do we do research in humanitarian disaster settings, and how complicated it can be, but also how to address this? And it's true, we see the same thing that you are saying, Ida, that there is a huge focus on the high impact events. I would say that the so-called CNN effect that we see in humanitarian crisis can also be the CNN effect of safety security. So if it is on CNN or the BBC nowadays, it's something that is more on the spotlight and considered. But something that we have seen in the safety security aspect of research is that it's not only about protecting ourselves, it's not only about our safety and security, not only at the safety and security of the people around us or research participants. So we have a whole comprehensive approach to safety and security, not only about the researchers. But something really important that we always highlight is that taking seriously safety and security considerations has an impact on our research practices. So taking it seriously will change our research methods and methodologies. It might even require that we change our research questions if we are really serious about, because for safety and security reasons, we might not go to some places, we might not be able to answer some questions and so on. So I don't want to explore further this, but my question is, safety and security is not separated from everyday humanitarian practices. So my question is, do you have any reflection about how safety and security, most focus, because you focus on security, not on safety, affect the everyday humanitarian system governance? I remember research that we did in South Sudan, for example, and it shows, we all have this idea that 8 actors are really agile and flexible, and they will go wherever people needed the most their support. The reality is quite different. We have seen that humanitarian actors are quite often stuck in path dependency approaches. They keep acting in the same places than ever for many reasons. And one of them is actually safety and security. It's quite difficult to build up safety and security schemes. So they end up staying in the same places. So this is just one example that I am aware of how safety and security affect humanitarian practices. But maybe you know others. I don't know if you can bring any other reflections about how all this research and security translate into humanitarian practices.
Yeah, what I've so my thesis, the field that I did it in, was political history. So I was also looking a little bit how security and the way that we manage security has developed over time. And the point where we are now is that it's very much a top-down approach. Back in the day, when there was less technology, less ability to stay connected, the connections were not so immediate, the responsibility rested much more on project managers. It was much more locally decided how to manage security and how to manage different threats. Now, when things have gotten bigger, humanitarian system has gotten bigger, security is much more top-down, it's centralized, which makes it also this kind of far-sweeping or very broad policies rather than tailored approaches for each context. So yeah, I think it's got a huge influence on how aid work is carried out on a daily basis. I know there's discussions, for example, in various different contexts on the use of something like barbed wire around your humanitarian compound. Does it increase your security by inhibiting hostile individuals coming in, or you being attacked or robbed or what have you? Or does it increase your insecurity by making you seem suspicious to the community around you, and like you have something to protect, like you're not in fact neutral and impartial? So it's a very contested kind of relationship. Then when you mentioned the researchers also in foreign contexts and the implications of that, I think an interesting consideration is kind of broadening the perspective of how we view the security implications of our research. When we think of, you mentioned data collection and how methods work and all of this. So we may think that how do I gather data? How do I organize my interviews? What are the implications to my interviewees? What about my own safety in these potentially hazardous areas? But what about the security and safety of the interviewees after I leave? What happens to them? Is there perhaps a threat from the government, from, I don't know, whoever may be active in the area? What are the implications of talking to me? Or what are the implications, maybe, even if you're outside the area, what are the implications of family and friends of these interviewees in these volatile, for example, conflict-affected areas? So kind of thinking a little bit outside our immediate research context and broadening how insecurity can kind of radiate out and have implications to individuals that are not even directly involved in our study.
Yeah, thanks so much. And definitely that's exactly what we do in our safety and security course. And when we share with the students how the participants how to do a risk assessments, we include this, the risk even after fieldwork periods, or so in the same line. I want to ask only one more question because I want to give more time to our participants here. It's about localization. And it's interesting because in the safety and security of research, we see a lot sometimes the so-called risk dumping. You know what I mean? Or we call it ethics laundering or risk laundering. So in research, many people said, oh, it's too unsafe for me to go to some places, so I'm going to use research assistants. I will use partners. But are there really partners with you? Or are actually they are less at risk than you, or are you just like dumping the risk somewhere else? And you are making it look nice. That's why we call it risk or ethics laundering. And some people is also quite critical about the localization agenda in humanitarian aid sector, in humanitarianism, because sometimes some actors might be using it in that way. You know, it's too unsafe, or it's too complicated, too challenging to go to places, but we have our local actors, local partners, and they can do it because they are locals, without really understanding that they are at different risks, sometimes even more risks. And as you said, with the idea of low violence and entanglement, they are in everyday practices risk. There are aid workers during the day, but in the mornings and in the afternoon, they are also family members, and they are probably at the same risk. So there is no clear boundaries. So I don't know if you want to share a bit more, if you have given any consideration, and this relates also with the question of Francis about the localization agenda, how it comes into consideration of, yeah, we're going to localize it, but also as you are seeing, those local actors are, and I prefer to say even national actors, are more at risk sometimes, if not oftenly or always.
Yeah. I mean, the promise of localization is that we're not only transferring, the humanitarian system is not only transferring operational responsibilities, but also resources, decision-making power, and so on. Whether this has been actually achieved is a debate, and of course, an ongoing process that's still developing. In reality, what we often see is that national actors are given a say or stake in deciding how something is implemented, whether something gets implemented in terms of, for example, security, whether you can go to a certain area, whether it's too hazardous or not, but not necessarily in the earlier stage when you're planning policies, when you're planning projects. So there's not necessarily a seat at the table. And this relates to what you were saying about risk dumping. You decide to implement something, and then you say, well, how should we do this? Another important and interesting thing that came up in my own interviews is the question of power, in the sense of who has the ability to say no. If you have individuals who are given the task of canvassing, I don't know, doing something, and you say, can you go to an area A? We are aware that it's potentially dangerous, but leave it to you to decide whether you go or not. And this seems like a very ethical thing to do, to give the opportunity to back out without any repercussions, and then we decide that we don't go there today, this week, at all. But at the same time, these people's livelihoods often depend on their daily salary, they have families depending on them. To what extent is there the ability to say no and give up work?
Exactly.
So again, things are super complicated, and always when you look a little bit under the surface, new things come up, and you could always keep on kind of digging further. And yeah.
Great, fascinating topic. And Lisa Patterson, that actually she raised her hand, is also working on localization of humanitarian action for her PhD. So I'm sure she also has a lot to share. I will leave it here, Tom, because of the sake of time, and to give the room to our participants. Thanks so much, Tom, for moderating. And again, Ida, congratulations for an amazing job.
Thanks so much.